Gritters, friends, family, new viewers, new subscribers, and all returning Gritters. Happy Wednesday. Grace and Grit here at Grace and Grit, we talk about the real stuff, the messy stuff, the untold truths of motherhood, womanhood, life, and everything in between. We do it all with no judgment, no shame, only grace. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the woman in the mirror. And when we don't recognize who we are. There's a moment that most of us experience, but it doesn't really get talked about out loud. It isn't a dramatic moment. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a breakdown or a life-altering decision. It's quiet, subtle, almost easy to dismiss. It happens when you catch your reflection and unexpectedly something in you pauses. Not because you dislike what you see, but because you don't quite recognize the woman in the mirror. What's confusing about it is nothing looks wrong. Your life might even look good from the outside. Responsibilities are being handled, people are depending on you, you're functioning, you're capable, you're doing what needs to be done. Yet, there's this faint but persistent sense that the woman looking back at you feels unfamiliar. Not worse, not broken, just different. What unsettles most of us isn't the change itself, it's the fact that we can't explain it. There's no single moment where everything shifted. There's no clear before and after. And there's no real decision that you can point to and say, that's when I stopped being me. Because it happened slowly, quietly, over time. Life shapes us while we're not looking. And if you've lived in survival mode for any length of time, survival has a way of forming your identity without asking permission. That's what today is about. Not self-improvement, not invention, not finding yourself in a trendy or surface level way. This is about grace and honesty and what it means to look at who you've become without judgment. Because many of us don't feel lost. We just feel unfamiliar to ourselves. And that's not the same thing. This feeling doesn't get named very often because on the surface, it feels ungrateful. We tell ourselves, you shouldn't feel this way. And we remind ourselves of everything we have. You minimize the disconnect because nothing is technically wrong. But internally, there's a quiet disorientation. You don't feel like the woman you used to be, and you don't yet understand who you are now. That gap is uncomfortable. We like familiar things. We like knowing ourselves. We like having language for who we are. We like being able to say, this is me. So when that language stops fitting, it can feel unsettling in ways we don't have words for. That's when the questions start forming. What happened to me? Why don't I feel like myself anymore? Did I lose something that I can't get back? Most women never ask these questions out loud. We think them quietly, usually late at night, and usually at those times when no one needs anything from us. When we have a moment to feel instead of function. We don't ask out loud because we're afraid of what the answers might imply. Afraid that it means we failed. Afraid that it means we've made wrong choices somewhere. And afraid that it means the cost of our lives is so much higher than we may have realized. So instead of naming the feeling, we rationalize it away. We tell ourselves, this is just adulthood. This is maturity. This is responsibility. This is what a strong woman looks like. And while some of that may be true, it's incomplete. Because strength that goes unnamed eventually turns into silence. And silence doesn't mean peace, it just means unspoken. Here's something we don't say enough. Most women don't lose themselves because they're careless. They lose themselves because they're responsible. They step into roles that require sacrifice. They become what's needed. They adjust. They adapt. They carry weight quietly. That's us, guys. Somewhere along the way, you became the dependable one, the one people can count on, the one who holds it together, the one who doesn't fall apart, or the one who figures it all out. You didn't do that because you wanted recognition. You didn't do it because you needed an award. You did it because someone had to. Because something needed to be done. And because walking away wasn't an option. Motherhood accelerates this. But it isn't limited to motherhood. It happens through grief, through hardship, through seasons where rest isn't available, through times where survival was the priority and self expression, that just felt like a luxury. And slowly, without realizing it, you start shaping yourself around what's required instead of who you are. Not intentionally, not selfishly, and not dramatically, just practically. Practicality doesn't ask how you feel, it asks what needs to be handled. It doesn't ask what brings you joy, it asks what can keep things running. It doesn't ask you who you're becoming, it asks what needs to be done next. And long, when you live that way long enough, pieces of you get quieter. Joy doesn't disappear, it gets muted. Curiosity doesn't vanish, but it stops being prioritized. Softness doesn't die, it just learns to wait. Not because those things don't matter, but because they weren't necessary for survival. Survival mode doesn't care about identity, it cares about endurance. And here's the part many women struggle to hear. If you've survived in a long season, you were supposed to change. Adaptation is not a failure, it's a response. When life slows down, when the crisis passes, when the noise fades just enough, you finally notice the distance between who you were and who you are now. And instead of compassion, most of us meet ourselves with criticism. We tell ourselves we shouldn't feel disconnected. We remind ourselves of everything we should be grateful for. And we minimize the grief because it feels unjustified. But grief doesn't require permission, it requires honesty. You can love your life and still miss the parts of yourself that existed before survival took over. Those truths do not cancel each other out. And that realization often arrives quietly. Maybe while looking in the mirror. Maybe in a random moment of stillness. Maybe when you realize you don't remember the last time you felt fully present as yourself. It doesn't cause panic, it causes awareness. And awareness, that can feel heavy at first because it forces you to admit something you've been avoiding. You've you've been living on autopilot longer than you realized. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you were coping. And coping takes energy. It takes focus. It takes intention. Over time, it reshapes you. When you finally notice the disconnect, the temptation is to rush past it, to label it as a phase, to distract yourself, to stay busy enough that you don't have to sit with the discomfort of not recognizing yourself. But the thing about awareness is that once it shows up, it doesn't leave quietly. You can ignore it for a while. You can talk over it. You can drown it out with productivity, but it waits. And eventually, it asks to be acknowledged. Most of us don't realize how much grief is tied to identity until we've experienced this moment. Not the kind of grief associated with loss that you can name, but the kind that lives underneath the surface. The grief of versions of ourselves that didn't get to keep growing. The grief of parts of us that were set aside for later and stayed there longer than we expected. This grief often feels confusing because it doesn't come with a clear reason. Nothing was taken, no one did anything wrong. Life simply required more of you than you anticipated, and you responded the best way you knew how. And still, something inside you aches. That ache doesn't mean you regret your life, it means you're aware of the cost. Every season costs something. Survival seasons just tend to cost pieces of selfhood. And that cost doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Adapting, it's not neutral, it shapes you, it trains you, it conditions your nervous system, your expectations, your emotional range. If you've lived in a season where you had to stay alert, you're likely more guarded. If you've lived in a season where emotions weren't safe, then you're probably a little bit more contained. If you lived in a season where others depended on you constantly, then you probably learned to minimize your own needs. That you didn't stop adapting when the seasons end it. That becomes part of you. So when life calms down, when there's finally space to breathe, you don't immediately feel relief. Oftentimes, we feel lost because we don't know how to exist outside of what was required. And that's not because something's wrong with us. It's because our body and identities learned how to function in a very specific way for a long time. And many women mistake this moment for failure. And we say things like, I should be happier than this. I should feel more fulfilled. I should be grateful. But that should language, it's often a sign that we are judging ourselves instead of listening. Gratitude does not erase grief. Responsibility does not cancel longing. And strength does not eliminate the need for tenderness. We're allowed to acknowledge the weight of what we carry without rewriting history or diminishing our choices. You didn't become unfamiliar to yourself because you did something wrong. You became unfamiliar because you did something hard for a long time. Many of us get stuck because we assume that not recognizing ourselves means that we need to fix something, that something is broken, and that we need to get back to who we used to be. But going back is rarely the answer because the woman you used to be didn't have the same experience. She didn't carry the same knowledge. She didn't endure what you have endured. You do not need to undo your life to reconnect with yourself. What you need is honesty and grace. Honesty about what that season you were in asked of you, what it cost, and what parts of you had to adapt to survive. This is where self compassion either deepens or disappears. So, when we meet this realization without grace, with harshness, we criticize ourselves for changing. We judge our emotional distance. We feel frustrated that we aren't who we used to be. Others, they begin to soften. They recognize that survival required narrowing of their focus, that endurance required certain traits to come forward while others stepped back. They stopped asking, what's wrong with me? And started asking, what happened to me? Those perspectives matter because what's wrong with me assumes defect. What happened to me invites understanding, and understanding creates room for grace. There's a quiet fear underneath this entire experience, a fear that if you really looked at yourself now, you won't like who you've become, that you'll see someone hardened, tired, disconnected, or dull. But most women don't see hardness when they finally look honestly. They see fatigue, resilience. They see someone who carried more than she ever talks about. And sometimes they see a woman who learned how to be needed so well that she forgot how to be known. That's a realization that can feel heavy because being needed is often rewarded, but being known requires vulnerability. Survival seasons reward usefulness. Healing seasons invite honesty. And honesty can feel unsafe when you've spent years prioritizing stability. There's also a cultural layer to this that matters. Women are often praised for disappearing quietly into responsibility, for being selfless, for being low maintenance, for not needing too much. So when you finally notice that you've become smaller inside, you might feel guilty for even noticing. But noticing is not betrayal, it's awareness. And awareness is the beginning of reintroduction. This season of your life may not be about discovering something new. It may be about meeting what's already there but hasn't been acknowledged. Meeting a woman who learned how to endure. Meeting the woman who adjusted again and again. Meeting the woman who became capable because she had to. And instead of asking her to explain herself or justify her changes, simply letting her be seen. Many women rush this part. They want clarity immediately. They want answers. They want direction. But clarity doesn't come from pressure. It comes from presence. You don't need to define yourself right now. You don't need a label. You don't even need a plan. You need permission to exist as you are without apologizing for the season that you survived. But not recognizing yourself, that doesn't mean you've lost yourself. It means you outgrew your old framework. And growth, even necessary growth, can feel disorienting, especially when it wasn't chosen freely, but it was required. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling this way. There's nothing weak about this moment. This is the moment where many women stand at the edge of deeper self understanding and they don't even realize it yet. And what happens next depends on how gently you treat yourself. There's a subtle but powerful shift that happens when a woman stops asking, "How do I get back to who I was?" and starts asking, "Who am I now?" That question isn't urgent, it isn't demanding, and it isn't trying to force an answer. It's just curious. And curiosity is far gentler than pressure. Most women don't realize how quickly they move into fixing mode when they feel unfamiliar with themselves. They start scanning for problems. They assume something must be wrong. And they think they need to change something, improve something, or correct something. But unfamiliar does not mean broken. Unfamiliar simply means you haven't spent time there yet. If you've moved to a new place, you wouldn't expect to know every street immediately. You wouldn't criticize yourself for feeling disoriented. You'd understand that orientation takes time. The same is true internally. You're living in a version of yourself shaped by experience, endurance, responsibility, and adapting. Of course, it feels unfamiliar. You haven't slowed down long enough to get acquainted. So, the invitation here is not reinvention, it's introduction. Introduction requires patience. You don't interrogate someone you're meeting for the first time. You listen, observe, and you notice. Many women have never given themselves permission to do that. They've only known how to assess themselves based on usefulness, productivity, output, and how well we hold things together and get stuff done. So when we stop and look inward, we don't know what to listen for. Here's something important. The woman you are does not need to justify herself. You don't need to explain why you changed. You don't need to defend your tiredness. You don't need to apologize for being quieter, more reserved, or less available. You adapted to survive, and that deserves understanding, not critique. There's always, or most often, a deep tenderness hidden underneath this season that we don't expect. When we finally stop pushing ourselves to perform and allow ourselves to simply be, all that stuff we stuffed down and made a spot for, all of those emotions start to surface. Not because we ignored them, but because we were delaying them. We put them down there until we had time to deal with them. Survival doesn't erase the emotions, it just suspends it. And suspension has a cost. When safety returns, emotions come back online. Not all at once, but gradually, confusingly, and most always inconveniently. You might feel sadness without a clear reason. You may feel grief without a specific loss. You may feel longing without knowing what you're longing for. That doesn't mean you're regressing. It means you're reconnecting. And reconnection often feels messy before it before it's peaceful. Many women expect healing to feel empowering immediately. We expect clarity, confidence, and direction. But the early stages of healing, they are often quiet, unsure, and emotionally exposed. Because once you're no longer numb and you're no longer rushing and you're no longer distracting yourself from what you feel, you are very present. And presence can feel uncomfortable when you're not used to it. That's why so many of us try to skip this stage. We want answers before the awareness. We want direction before the understanding. Because we know all good and well what we done shoved down there to deal with later. We don't want it coming back up. But the woman you are now needs to be met before she can be guided. She needs the space to exist without being evaluated. Ask yourself this honestly. When was the last time you allowed yourself to simply notice how you feel without trying to change it? Without analyzing it, without spiritualizing it, and without pushing past it. Just noticing it. Most of us don't do this because we're afraid of what we're going to find. We're afraid that if we stop long enough, everything will come undone. But what usually comes up isn't chaos, it's honesty. Honesty about exhaustion, honesty about emotional depletion, honesty about how much you've been carrying quietly. And that honesty doesn't demand immediate action, it just asks for compassion. There's a difference between awareness and obligation. Awareness says, this is where I am. Obligation says, now I have to do something about it. Grace allows awareness without obligation. You're allowed to see yourself clearly without fixing yourself immediately. That may feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to being proactive, capable, and solution oriented. But not everything that it's not sorry, not everything that you acknowledge needs to be addressed right away. Some things just simply need to be seen. So many of us fear that if we soften, everything's going to fall apart. That if we stop being the strong one, nobody else is going to step up. And if we acknowledge our needs, then we're going to be disappointed. That fear didn't come from nowhere. We learned it. It came from seasons where strength was required, weakness felt unsafe, where holding it all together mattered. So if you feel resistance to slowing down internally, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're protecting yourself. Protection just needs to be gently updated when the seasons change. You don't dismantle it overnight. You don't force vulnerability. You don't rush exposure. You begin by telling yourself the truth. And the truth might be something simple like, I'm tired, in a way that taking a nap isn't going to fix. Or, I honestly have no idea what I need right now. Or, I've been functioning way more than feeling. Those truths don't make you weak. They make you honest. And honesty is where real connection begins with yourself. You don't need to pressure this process. You don't need to turn it into a project. You don't need to announce it or explain it. You can move quietly, gently, internally. Meeting yourself without fixing yourself is one of the most important things a woman can do because the world requires improvement, not presence. But presence, that's what restores. And the woman in the mirror doesn't need to be improved before she's worthy of compassion. She just needs to be met. When survival is no longer the dominant demand in your life, but your inner world hasn't caught up yet, the circumstances may have changed. The urgency may have lessened. The crisis may be over, but internally, we're still braced. Our bodies remember what was required. So even when things are calmer, we feel restless, disconnected, or on edge. Most of us are like, we should feel better than we do right now. And you might wonder why that peace feels unfamiliar. That's not being ungrateful. It's transition. Moving from surviving to living is not automatic. It's a shift that happens gradually and awkwardly. Survival teaches us to focus on what's immediate. Living invites us to consider what's meaningful. Survival narrows your world, living expands it. And expansion can feel unsafe and scary. When you've spent years prioritizing stability, unpredictability, even good unpredictability, that can feel threatening. You've learned to control what you can, to manage outcomes, to anticipate needs. So when life opens up a little bit, instead of relief, you get it disoriented. We don't know what to do with that space. How do you move without urgency? What what do we do when nothing is actively demanding us? That uncertainty can feel like loss, but it's really just unfamiliar freedom. Freedom doesn't always feel light. Sometimes it feels like standing still after running for a long time, not sure if you're even allowed to stop. This is why most of us believe something is wrong with us. We think we should feel more joyful, more energized, more motivated now that things are calmed down and settled. But we got to give our systems time to recalibrate because we don't go from holding our breath for years and years and years to just being able to breathe deeply overnight. So if you're feeling emotionally flat or unsure in this season, that does not mean you're broke. It means you're adjusting. And adjusting requires gentleness, it requires grace. This is also where identity questions become louder. When survival was the priority, your role defined you. What you did mattered way more than who you were. You were needed, you were essential, you were relied upon. And while that was heavy, it also gave you clarity. Now, without a constant demand, we feel unanchored. Who am I when nobody needs me? Who am I when I'm not fixing something? Who am I if I'm not holding everything together? These questions, oh, they can feel they're a lot because being needed can become the substitute for being known. And being needed is not the same as being seen. Being seen, well, that starts with seeing ourselves. And this is where many of us try to fill that space quickly. We try to stay busy. We create new obligations. We find new problems to solve. Not because we want more responsibility, but because responsibility feels familiar. Stillness is risky. Stillness leaves room for all that stuff we shove down to come up. So instead of slowing down internally, we fill our life with motion. But motion without meaning leads to exhaustion. And at some point, your body and spirit, they're going to ask for something different. They're going to ask for alignment, not with productivity, but with truth. And alignment doesn't require radical change, it just requires awareness. It asks you to notice when you're operating out of habit instead of intention. It asks you to notice what drains you now versus what sustained you then. It asks you to consider whether the roles that we're still carrying belong in this season or do they belong in the season past. This is not about quitting your life, it's about updating it. We carry outdated expectations of ourselves, expectations formed in survival seasons that no longer apply. We still expect ourselves to push through exhaustion, to suppress emotion, to manage everything alone. But the season has changed, and what once kept us alive, now it's keeping us small. And oh, that can be like a confrontation with ourselves, because letting go of those patterns can feel like betrayal, especially if you were a woman who endured. But honoring that woman, that doesn't require continuing to suffer. Recognize what you needed then and what you need now. You're allowed to outgrow. You're allowed to outgrow the coping mechanisms that you once had to use to protect you. You're allowed to soften without losing strength. Strength doesn't disappear when survival ends, it transforms. It becomes discernment, boundaries, and self respect. And that version of strength looks quieter. It doesn't perform, it doesn't prove, and it doesn't rush. It listens. And listening is how you begin to recognize yourself again. Not the version of you from before everything got heavy, the version of you shaped by experience, wisdom, and resilience. That woman deserves to be known. That woman deserves room. And that woman deserves grace. I want to thank every one of y'all for sharing this space with me today. And I hope you'll tune in next week for part 2 of The Woman in the Mirror. Until then, I'll see you.